So, I'd like to talk for a brief moment about the developments in India in the 18th and 19th centuries. As we left off with India, we left off with the Mughal Empire and the rise of Aurangzeb, the Mughal emperor who persecuted Hindus and intended to institute a very strict form of Islamic law over his entire society, which was very religiously diverse. This led to a number of rebellions, including the First Mughal Maratha War, which lasted over 20 years. The Marathas were a caste of Hindu peasant soldiers, kind of like rural fighters who joined the Mughal army and played a dominant role in the Mughal army, but they revolted under their leader Shivali when their religious beliefs were being persecuted by the state. And they held off Aurangzeb for over 20 years. The Marathas formed a very powerful confederation of rulers. And though they dominated most of northern India, they were not able to subjugate it completely, nor were they able to protect northern India from outside invaders, particularly the Afghans, who invaded northern India and defeated the Marathans at the Third Battle of Panipat and temporarily halted the spread of the Marathan political system. This is important for two reasons. The first is that it highlights the critical problem in Indian history throughout the entire Indian subcontinent. By Indian, we mean subcontinental history, not just the nation of modern India. And that is the extreme diversity of the subcontinent, its peoples, its languages, its cultures, its religions. It's been very, very difficult for rulers to dominate even the northern half of India entirely, let alone all of the Indian subcontinent. The second reason that this is significant is that it allows us to understand better the power that European militaries were able to take during this time period on the subcontinent. When you look at India, you're looking at a massive society with a massive amount of resources and people and very powerful armies and warriors. The Maratha Confederacy was powerful. The Mughals had powerful armies, but they were disunited. There is kind of a myth that's told that, well, the Europeans engaged in divide and conquer. No. The divide part was already firmly established by the time the European powers arrived. The first being the Portuguese, who captured the city of Goa and would rule that city up until independence. The French would take Pondicherry in French, and establish that as a colony on the coast. But these were coastal settlements that the Europeans were able to take in part due to their superior navies. And we'll talk more about that in a moment. But the greatest colonial power, a European power, in India would eventually develop into Great Britain, which would be the first power that would unify the entire Indian subcontinent under one banner. British colonial power in India began with the East India Company, which was a private company that was set up to trade in spices. India produced massive amounts of cinnamon, other spices in abundance. India was the world's center for spice production, just like China was the world's center for silk and porcelain production. All these goods were highly valued the world over, and they were not produced within Europe. So the East India Company was set up to profit off of this trade, and of course, due to advances in European military technology, particularly the advance of what was called the caravel, which was kind of the equivalent of an aircraft carrier of its day, a very small, fast, but very stout ship that could carry many cannon. Europeans had a major naval advantage, and of course, over time, that advantage accelerated with the development of frigates in the 18th century. This made European powers extremely lethal on the coast. And in time, the East India Company began to establish a trade foothold and to deal with local Indian rulers, and eventually began to intervene in the political structures of those with whom they traded. Between 1775 and 1818, the East Empire Company, or East India Company, was able to effectively crush the Marathan military. They were able to completely dominate the coasts. The Marathans attempted a kind of hit-and-run strategy with much smaller, much weaker vessels that was surprisingly effective for a period of time, but ultimately could not protect trade and protect the coasts. The British were able to send very highly disciplined British troops with the best muskets at the time. And keep in mind, Great Britain is becoming the world's premier power during this era. During the American Revolution, when France sided with the United States against Great Britain and France went to war over French territory in India. And the British were very successful in the World War. Even if they were not successful in maintaining the American colonies, they were able to take French possessions in India and add those to their empire. And between 1775 and 1818, the Marathan Confederacy was crushed on land as well as sea. And so the East India Company became a dominant power in northern India. After seizing control of large parts of the Indian subcontinent, the British began to develop the subcontinent with the new technologies that were being developed in the West. For example, with the development of the railroad, with the steamship. And they were laying down an infrastructure that would later prove useful for an independent India. In addition to this, they're introducing the English language as the language of administration. And this is useful for contemporary India due to the fact that English being an outside language introduced by foreign conquerors, it doesn't carry any innate bias between ethnic groups. So all of the different language groups in India can use English as kind of a neutral third-party language to communicate with one another for government and trade in contemporary society. It doesn't privilege, for example, Hindi over Tamil or other languages. So that is one advantage that the British left. However, this was not being done out of a sense of altruism. This was being done for profit, particularly for the wealthy of British society. So India became a massive exporter of raw materials. First of cotton, which had been grown in India since the days of the Harappan civilization, if you remember at the beginning of the semester. And also later on, rubber. Rubber trees were very prominent in India. Of course, once the bicycle was invented, and then later the automobile, this would have a great industrial use. So this was being done for profit. And this profit motive would play a major role in the American Civil War due to and a desire to see the United States fail. In the 1860s, the British Empire considered intervening in the American Civil War. One of the arguments that the pro-interventionist British had was, well, the Confederate States were supplying Britain with cotton. By blockading the southern states, the northern states were depriving British markets of cotton to produce textiles in British factories. And the anti-intervention, pro-union part of the British government began to advocate for the importation of cotton from India. So the British actually got an alternate source of cotton that effectively nixed any attempt to intervene in the American Civil War. Also, the British began to promote the cultivation of poppy plants in India. which poppies, produce opium, which is an opiate, which is a drug, a narcotic. And it would have a dramatic effect on world history because we really see the beginning of the international drug trade coming out of British India. The British East India Company ruled up until 1857. After 1858, the British government directly annexed India to its empire. And the reason for this is that the British East India Company was blamed for mismanaging a rebellion called the Sepoy Rebellion. The Sepoy Rebellion, or Sepoy Mutiny, was a rebellion of Indian troops under British command called sepoys. Sepoys were the Indians who were hired and trained by the British East India Company to fight in their armies. A very foolish decision was made to create cartridges for the firearms that the Sepoy troops were using, which were coated in both cow and pig grease. And so what this meant was that at that point you bit off part of the cartridge to load into the weapon, that these troops, who were either Hindu or Muslim, would have to come into contact with the fat from an animal that offended their religious sensibilities. The Hindu troops were not allowed to consume beef. The Muslim troops were not allowed to consume pork. And of course, in Europe, both were consumed regularly. So this mismanagement, this foolish venture actually caused a massive rebellion that almost saw the British East India Company driven from India, wherein their own troops revolted against them. After this rebellion, which the British government very ruthlessly crushed, firing the Sepoy leaders out of cannons in a very brutal fashion, the British Crown directly began to administer India as a province. From that point on, British power in India was completely unchallenged. The British government would eventually take over the entire subcontinent, including the modern nation of Myanmar, or which used to be called Burma. The main forces of resistance in the Indian subcontinent were the countries of Nepal and Bhutan. And this is due to the fact that the Nepalese Gurkhas, ethnic group in Nepal, were very, very ferocious warriors who knew their Himalayan terrain very well and fought the British to a standstill. And the British actually formed an alliance with the Gurkhas and used them in their armies, even in the modern era. There are Gurkha regiments in the modern British Army. And these Gurkhas fought in World War I and World War II, considered very, very elite soldiers. In fact, their trademark knife is very well known. It's called a kukri, and it's a very small weapon, relatively speaking, given how deadly it is. It could actually take the head off of a British soldier in the mountainous terrain. And so the British decided that they would court the favor of the Gurkhas and use them as their own troops.